Well, just finished a long day of work, and I thought I'd do a video. I was thinking today, just you get comments on your older videos, they kind of trickle in, and every once in a while something kind of clicks, and it's like, oh, I should address this. And um, this isn't exactly a point somebody. Any bad arguments against free markets, that they lead to monopolies, that they're pro-rich, that they hurt the poor,
Or that they're going to poison, the companies will poison their customers, that it's invalid because there's a chance it could devolve into a war, which apparently only invalidates certain systems and not others. Um, and I've kind of spent years and years looking at every claim, every issue. Myself, I wasn't raised anarcho-capitalist or a free market person. I went to public schools just like most everybody else. I was fed the same. There's a very important role for government to curb the abuses of free market capitalism, which is more or less responsible for things like the Great Depression and people getting poisoned and that sort of thing. And government's just this great force for good. And just over the years, I would examine each of those claims, not systematically or all at once, but just I think I'll look into that for a while and keep looking into it and until I would be satisfied that that's not really the case. Um, but then someone has to ask, are there actually problems with a free market and Capistan society? And I do think that there are some problems. I don't think that they're major, irrevocable ones, and I don't think that they're problems that really can be solved by the state. But there's two I want to mention. One was mentioned by Mises, who, after all, wasn't an anarcho-capitalist, but pretty close as far as minarchists go, and definitely a libertarian. And he mentioned the fear that on a free market, since the productions of goods and services is so advanced and always increasing, that the potential for very powerful and destructive weapons to be produced and disseminated throughout the populace was at least possible. There'd be nothing to prevent it, and that there was the potential there, since the destructive power of such weapons is only hypothetically limited, not practically limited. Uh, you know, that's something to be worried about. And I think this is true. I don't think this is totally false. Now, if you see my gun control videos, I'm straight libertarian on this. I don't think, I mean, even more libertarian than a lot of libertarians are, because I think that there can be allowances for even weapons, so-called weapons of mass destruction. I mean, they are weapons of mass destruction, but I think the emphasis is kind of arbitrary. Um, But let's just look at our society today. Right now, the government heavily restricts certain types of guns, especially fully automatic weapons. And even within the numbers that they allow, they restrict that. So you can't get new ones, I believe. Someone might correct me on this, but you can't have any fully automatic weapons that were manufactured after 1986, which means there is a set supply. There can't be any more. And even the ones that you can have, you have to have a Class 3 FFL, which is not, I mean, it's not super hard to get, but it's more of a hurdle than most people are willing to go through. So uh, it's pretty heavily restricted. And then there's all kinds of other weapons, RPGs, and much larger caliber artillery, that sort of thing. And if there were no government controls, I think this stuff would start to find its way on the market, because it was before. Um, after World War I, there was still no gun control in the United States at all, and there was World War I era weaponry that was available. And I'm told, I have not verified this, but Boston Tea Party reports, and I trust him on this issue, that you could buy fully automatic 20 millimeter cannons through the mail on the Sears Roebuck catalog. That would be you wouldn't even have to use your name, and you could just send a money order and get these. This is a weapon that could be used to shoot down aircraft, any aircraft back then. Even today, it would be an effective weapon, although not against the super high flying stuff. Just to give you some idea, a 20 millimeter is relative to a 50 cal. What a 50 cal is to, like, a 30-06 or a 30-30, something along those lines. civil war. But those are out in private hands. Some of them were purchased, and yet, um, you know, society has continued to exist, and you see a lot of more people buying machine guns and more powerful calibers and that kind of stuff. And there's a risk there. There's a danger that they could fall into quote unquote the wrong hands, irresponsible hands. I think though, and I mentioned this in one of my previous videos, there's a contravening factor in that. The more destructive, the more powerful a weapon is, more likely the more expensive it is, the harder it is to produce. Uh, and so for it to be produced in the first place, uh, initially, I mean, when it's invented, implies the reason and the foresight to be able to produce such a weapon, which implies that you're not crazy and that you are uh, responsible enough and high functioning enough that you're able to produce something like that or to afford to produce something like that. Now, that doesn't preclude the possibility that you are sane and then you suddenly become insane and after you've produced it and you have possession. Sure, that's a hypothetical scenario that's possible, but it became suddenly a lot less likely when you added, a sequence of events that gets you to where you need to go. Uh, and that's, adding that, well, you're smart enough to and rich enough to own a weapon and then you become retarded. Is it possible? Yes. Is it that likely? Well, it's less likely than you might think. And the other thing is, even if you're not a producer, but you're simply a consumer of these goods, the more pricey and powerful they are, the more valuable they likely will be to whoever is purchasing them, and the more incentive they have to take care of it. If you buy a $100 Saturday Night Special handgun, you might end up leaving that on your kitchen table or maybe on the front porch or something by accident. It's unlikely, but it's possible, and someone could steal it and commit a crime or whatever. But if you bought a couple 50 caliber Barrett Arms guns for 5-6 gold ounces a piece, the chances that you don't have a 1 gold ounce gun safe to keep them in is kind of unlikely. If you're dropping that kind of money, the idea that you would then just leave that out on the corner, uh, ready to be stolen is, it's not impossible, but it's not that likely. So even though this is a problem, it's not a dire one. Uh, Now I think I've addressed mostly that problem in my gun control videos, but the other one I want to talk about is health. And I think this is a serious problem. Uh, our body and our genes were set up a long time ago, mostly before civilization. I think there's probably some. I mean, there's development all the time. It's very slow. Up to this point, it has been anyway. And you know, it's hard to say how much of our genetic code has developed since the Neolithic, since the Industrial Revolution, since the Mesolithic, yada yada yada. Even since uh, archaic humans or Homo heidelbergensis or the Neanderthals, uh, who apparently, if you're European, if you're not African, you are at least partially descended from the Neanderthals, apparently. Uh, we evolved in an environment that was basically calorie scarce relative to what we experience today. Um, in a place where it was vital to get every little bit of nutrients that you could from society, from the environment, not society, from the ecosystem, and that's why we have these we have a taste for sweets and for fats because these are things that are hard to find and they're very valuable. And so, our brains are programmed to like them and to crave them. And throughout human history, they've been relatively rare that it's to the point where it's not a problem that you have cravings for sugars and fats and salts because they're relatively scarce, and so your cravings are doing you a favor. Because if you didn't have those cravings, if you just, oh, I think I'll just eat some of this, low nutrient vegetable material, and it fills my belly, and that's satisfying enough to me. You'll live a very unhealthy life and probably die. Or if you're craving sweet things, you're going to have a more varied diet. And if you crave meat, you're going to blah blah blah. Well, thanks to free markets and capitalism, there is now so much of this stuff available, so much of this food, that it's insane. Even the failures of the species become morbidly obese, or can, they don't all do this obviously, become morbidly obese from the availability of all these things. And now the increase in the weight is actually a really complex issue for which there isn't a definitive answer. In fact, someone was telling me the other day, I was commenting how much I would lose weight in Utah, and how I noticed other people would lose weight in Utah. And he's saying, well, you're up at altitude and it's colder. And he basically, I forget who this was, but he was saying the fact that we have indoor microenvironments like indoor heating greatly reduces the amount of calories that we burn. If you were living in a very cold house, it was maybe heated with a wood stove or not heated at all, your body would have to burn calories to keep warm. The fact that your house is being heated some other means and your car is heated and that you're basically at a temperate temperature all day means that you're not burning calories to keep yourself from freezing to death. And that might also be an explanation for the weighing. Or that's probably part of the reason that we become so fat, uh, relatively speaking. There are other things. The BMI index is actually a problematic thing, but I think it's safe to say that it is a problem. There's so much available. There's this abundance of these things. It's just so at your fingertips. It's everywhere. Every gas station. I mean, this is. Can you imagine like a group of hunter gatherers, troping through some really arid environment, passing scrub brush and the occasional decayed remains of some long dead animal, and maybe they see a snake or a scorpion to eat, and then they walk up to a 7-Eleven that's got Slurpees and Twinkie, not Twinkies anymore, but beef jerky and little sandwiches and hot dogs on rollers and just all the bottled water and juice, and it's it's like more plenty than they can imagine in their entire lives, and it's just some throwaway corner store to us. Uh, Even the very poor can afford uh, basically more food than they could ever hope to eat. And there are. This is actually a critique of capitalism that you kind of actually do hear some liberals say. Um, speak about it more generally in terms of consumerism. They'll say, "Oh, we live in this consumerist society." I think they haven't really reconciled this very well, because most of them at the same time will defend the government and be like, "Well, look at all the prosperity we have." Well, other than the material overproduction, so-called, of capitalism, it's unclear what they would mean by the prosperity, what they would be referencing. So it's kind of weird. On the one hand, they condemn capitalism for producing prosperity. On the other hand, they laud government for having produced prosperity or had a hand in its production in some way. Um, but I forget, there was an author. He was a professor. I think he was on John Stossel. He wrote a book. I believe it was titled "Consumed: How Capitalism Makes Us All Children and How We're Basically All helplessly, you know, at trying to sate these base urges for sugar or whatnot," which is interesting. I mean, here's a guy who's uh, basically a rent-a-scholar for the government. I mean, he works at the university, and he'll say whatever he thinks is going to make his bosses look good. But I mean, I hear this quite a bit. It's also funny. The Venus Project people will say, "Oh, consumption. Oh, the society is decadent and there's too much," and then they criticize the society for artificial scarcity, and then their answer is a society where no one has to work and everyone gets everything that they want, which is what most Venus Project people believe. I mean, there are a couple who are saying, "Oh, it's going to be rationed, and you're only going to get X, Y, and Z, and that, and no more." But most of them think whatever you want, the magic robots will just give it to you. And I find that very interesting, that you could condemn a society's consumerist, and then say, "Well, your ideal society is one where anyone consume whatever they want, regardless of what inputs they put into the system." That's just kind of a weird. So liberals will bring up this point, but they don't really have a very coherent view of it. They don't have a consistent view of it.
It's one of those vague kind of things that, well, there's something that's bad in society. It must be capitalism's fault, uh, and uh, and that's that. But I think it is a serious concern because the market is sating our needs. These goods are being produced because people want these goods, and people want these goods because we're programmed genetically to want them. But the market has a solution to this because people value not being fat. And let me just say what I mean by fat. Fat is when you're not happy with your weight. If you're happy with what you have, then that's fine. If you're content, I was just talking to my coworker today. And he brought a whole bag of these really 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 sweet cookies that his family had made. So this wasn't necessarily capitalism. Well, they had ingredients that he had to get at the store, but it was a huge bag, and I wasn't going to eat one because I am trying to be paleo and all that shit. But um, it was kind of discourteous, and one isn't going to really hurt you. So I ate one, and it was really, really rich. And he had a huge bag of these things, and I was like, "Are you going to eat all of those tonight? Like that's his lunch for his shift?" And he's like, "Probably." And I was like, "Well, whatever makes you happy." And he commented, "Well, my wife says I'm going to have, cholesterol and blah blah blah." So he knows it, and he still would rather have the taste. And I have a hard time rebuking him in any kind of normative, objective way. But if you value uh, your health in some, and you have a conception of health that has some kind of objective standard to it, which a individual can, society really can't. But you can say, hey, I want to be a marathon runner. Well, a marathon runner implies certain things about your physiology, or I want to be a weightlifter. That implies certain things, or I want to be X or Y or Z. There isn't a normative way to say everybody ought to be a marathon runner, or everyone ought to be a weightlifter, or everyone ought to be within a certain range on the BMI or whatever. But if you have that desire, the market provides that also. And so, we'll have news stories, and I've seen it, even though I don't watch the news very much, where they talk about this consumerism, but then they'll have stories about the, health industry, the amount of exercise equipment, the amount of weight. People say the United States is the fattest society, but it's also the one that spends the most on health. There's the most gyms, the most weightlifters, the most bodybuilders, the most health enthusiasts. There's all these different ranges, all these different diets, all these different systems, all these different ideologies. I mean, there's whole different philosophies on health. And if you go to Ethiopia, I'm going to tell you, there's no like trendy diets. There's no, because there it's about I need to eat so I don't die. Julian Simon, and he didn't come up with this, but this is where I read it. He said, there's a saying: if you don't have any food, you have one problem. If you have plenty of food, you have lots of problems. The idea being, if you don't have food, I mean, you're going to die, and so your number one, everything else is secondary. You have to get food after, of course, water and air. Uh, but once you have food, then you start. It's kind of like the marginal theory of value applied to prices. That okay, well now that my greatest desire, aka continuing my life, is reached, now what do I? What's my next most important desire? And that's like that's the top one for most people. There are people who commit suicide. There are other people who have other ideals that they pursue higher than their life, basically ideas or values that you're willing to die for. That's rare, but it happens. That's usually most people's number one thing at any given point, which is why people put such a high price on it. Number two, who knows? I mean, there's probably a toss up there: love, sex, children, uh, some kind of fulfillment of life. I mean, there's a whole bunch, and as you go down the list, and when we get to things like having a cat, skiing, uh, having a flat screen TV or a sofa, or watching the Brady Bunch reruns. I mean, it becomes the potential numbers of ordinal wants just becomes astronomical and becomes really, really silly to talk about. Well, we have a pyramid and we're going to give everybody what they really need because everyone's pyramid is different. But the point is that whatever it is that you do value, the market's going to provide that also, and it provides it at lowering costs and at better efficiency. Because think about it like this: if you were
a farmer, say you were a farmer in 1900 and you were overweight, then that could have happened, uh, and you decided you wanted to lose weight. What would you do? You couldn't go online. You couldn't watch TV or listen to the radio. You'd have to find a book, which there weren't libraries ever for you were a farmer. That pretty much meant you were probably rural. And getting the information to tell you how to change your ways. I mean, there's probably anecdotal evidence. Your grandmother would tell you what to do. Your neighbors might tell you what to do. But actual, really scientifically valid, marketable, useful information would have been relatively expensive. Eventually, he could have found a book or a pamphlet. Just the time and energy expended just to find it would have been not inconsiderable. But eventually he could have, and maybe by the now you just go on YouTube and there's more than you can even watch, and it's essentially free. I mean, there's costs in having a computer and having access to the internet, but you can even get away with that for free, given how many free access places there are. So the cost is very much lower. And back then he probably would have had to settle for just a couple popularized texts. Now you can gauge an enormous range of possibilities and make it fit whatever your very specific needs or desires happen to be. And that's quite remarkable. That's, you know, the level of choice that you have, the number of options that you have if you want to be healthy is astronomically huge. I mean, the Soviet Union, how many choices did you have to be on a diet? Well, everyone was on a diet, but I mean, assuming that you had capitalist levels of food available, how would you get in shape in the Soviet Union? I mean, would you go to the local gym? No, you probably have to join the army or something. I mean, it's just uh, so it is a problem. I think it is a problem. There's so much, and uh, if people aren't explicit and careful about what they want and what they need, it's very easy. Like the a hunter gatherer is not going to give up walking past Slurpees and Whoppers and beef that's already cooked. I mean, can you imagine how much better that is? How much easier that is than hunting a buffalo and killing it and then processing it on the savannah and then eating little bits of it as you fight off a lion. I mean, even once you get the steak, you're gonna end up burning half the steak just to get it. Now it's just you pull up in your car to the drive-through window and they give you a pound of it, piping hot, wrapped in a carbohydrate bun with a whole bunch of vegetables and a whole bunch of fats and sauces and mayonnaise and whatever, and uh, you're on your way. You don't have to get out of your seat. And I think they've done studies where like hunter-gatherer societies that when they get subjected to this, they don't like, oh, let's stick to the land and keep eating berries and warthog anus and whatever other meager existence we have. They go to the fast food place too, and they end up exploding in terms of weight. I think there was a case of a tribe of Indians who some of them lived in Mexico and some of them lived in the United States. And the ones in the United States have just been exposed to modernity, and the ones in Mexico haven't, and they still continue eating spiders and bird shit or whatever else they need, cactuses. And like the average weight of the ones in the United States is like 50% more or something than the ones in Mexico. Some ridiculous amount like that. They all have diabetes and whatever. But so that's a problem. But then there's also a solution in there for those who want it. And for those who want to enjoy, I mean, the the pleasures of food intake, then they have that option also, which is something they wouldn't have in a non-market system. If you want to say we're going to have this Spartan, uh, you know, anti-consumerist society, well, okay, then we will have the option then to all be thin and lean and hopefully not malnourished, although that's where most of these systems are going to end up. But then nobody would have the option of going out and having a pizza every day and doing things like that. Uh, and there's no way to say that the one is wrong and the other is right, or vice versa. So I think these are problems with capitalism. Maybe there's some other ones. I guess you could sum it up as saying, the main problem with capitalism is that it allows us uh, to be better able to fulfill whatever wishes we happen to have, and then the that fact means that we sometimes have to deal with consequences. It's like that movie, The Sphere, which I thought was a really bad movie. Samuel L. Jackson was in it, and it was about these people who these scientists who discovered a spaceship at the bottom of the ocean, and it turned out that it was an American spaceship from the future that had crash landed in the past. It had been on the bottom for years, and inside of it they found this thing called it was basically a sphere. That's the name of the movie. It's a really unoriginal name. I don't remember if the sphere was organic or living or if it was metallic. It was definitely alien, and the human spaceship in the future had found it and then somehow ended up in the past. Anyway, what ends up happening is this sphere will grant whatever wishes humans have. So you want uh, whatever you're thinking about, the sphere will manifest. And at the end they realize that ends up being a kind of a problem, because they have nightmares about giant squid, and giant squid will then attack the undersea base, and the whole bunch of it turned into a horror movie. And they said, well, humanity's not ready to have what it wants, but uh, if an individual person is going to pay the consequences of getting what they want, then there's a reciprocal counter incentive or disincentive for them to mess up, and so that's going to put the brakes. It's not going to stop them, but it's going to put the brakes. That's a braking mechanism for things getting out of control. Um, and the only other alternative is to basically put everybody in a straitjacket and say you don't get to develop the way you want, which means society won't develop the way that it should, or the way that it otherwise would. It will be retarded in the literal sense. And I just this is an issue. We have to cope with this issue. That's the price of being uh, who a human is, coping with the fact that the only thing that we really have to worry about is ourselves. We don't have to worry about gorillas or lions or anything like that. We have to worry and consciously think about what it is we really want. There's a whole body of fiction and science fiction and psychology. There's a whole fields of culture and literature devoted to examining questions of should we want this, should we want that, how should we cope with this or that, and that option, it has its pitfalls, it has its risks, it has its dangers, maybe even severe dangers. Like I said, nukes could be very dangerous. Obviously, I think it's highly unlikely that some crazy person would just end up with one, other unless of course he's a politician, say in North Korea. That would not be an example of the free market leading to a nuke problem. But the only alternative is basically dystopian. So I really don't see this as being much of a choice. But anyway, let me know what you think, and that's that.